Part 2, Exodus in History. The road out of empire, the night of Passover has passed. Egypt has been shaken. The firstborn have fallen. The lamb has been slain. Blood has marked the doors, and Israel begins to move. This is the road out of empire. But deliverance is not simple. Freedom does not begin with comfort. It begins with urgency. Israel leaves in haste. No time for leavened bread. No time to settle accounts. No time to build a future by sight. They walk out carrying dough, belongings, children, memories, fear, and hope. They are no longer slaves, but they are not yet formed. That is one of the great truths of Exodus. God can bring his people out of Egypt in a night, but getting Egypt out of his people takes a generation. The first movement is escape. The deeper movement is transformation, because Exodus is not only about leaving somewhere, it is about becoming someone. Now comes the sea, the Red Sea, or Yam Suf. There is debate over the exact location. Some translations say Red Sea. The Hebrew phrase can mean Sea of Reeds. Some argue for a northern marsh or lake region near Egypt. Others argue for a deeper crossing. Some propose the Gulf of Suez. Others propose the Gulf of Aqaba. The geography is debated. But the theological image is clear. Israel is trapped. Sea in front, Egypt behind. No way out. Then God makes a way. The waters divide. Israel passes through. Egypt pursues. The waters return. The army is drowned. The slaves stand free on the far shore. This is Exodus in one image. God makes a road where no road exists. Historically, scholars may debate location, wind, tides, marshes, routes, and wording. But the meaning of the story is unmistakable. Deliverance is not merely leaving Egypt. Deliverance is passing through death into new life. The sea is a boundary. On one side, slavery, on the other, freedom. On one side, Pharaoh, on the other, the Lord's future. On one side, old identity. On the other, covenant identity. The sea crossing becomes one of the Bible's great symbols. The prophets remember it. The Psalms sing it. The New Testament sees baptismal imagery in it. God brings his people through water. The waters that destroy the enemy become the waters through which the people pass. Again, Genesis echoes. God brings order through waters. Noah passes through judgment waters in the ark. Israel passes through sea waters out of Egypt. Later, Christ passes through death itself and opens the way to life. The Bible is not a pile of disconnected miracles. It is patterned. Water, judgment, deliverance, new beginning. That is biblical history. Now, after the sea, Israel sings. Exodus 15, the Song of the Sea, is one of the oldest feeling pieces of poetry in the Bible. It is victory song, worship song. The Lord is a man of war. That line offends some modern ears. But for slaves, it is hope. If God is not a warrior, then Pharaoh wins. If God does not fight for the oppressed, then empire reigns forever. The God of Exodus is not passive. He acts. He judges. He throws down horse and rider. He delivers the weak from the strong. The Song of the Sea is not polite religious reflection. It is the cry of people who have watched their captors drown. That may sound harsh, but we must remember what Egypt did. Egypt enslaved. Egypt beat. Egypt murdered sons. Egypt refused warning after warning. Judgment is terrifying because evil is terrible. A sentimental God could not deliver Israel. A merely tolerant God could not end Pharaoh. The Lord fights, and the slaves sing. But then something shocking happens. Almost immediately, the people complain. They are free, but not yet faithful. This is one of the most realistic parts of Exodus. Deliverance from Egypt happens in a night. Getting Egypt out of Israel takes a generation. People can be physically removed from bondage while still mentally shaped by it. They miss the food. They fear the desert. They distrust Moses. They accuse God. They romanticize slavery. They say, "Were there no graves in Egypt?" They say, "We remember the flesh pots." They say, "You brought us out here to die." This is brutally honest. The Bible does not portray Israel as noble heroes marching confidently into freedom. They panic. They grumble. They doubt. They are delivered people with slave habits. That is psychologically profound. Oppression damages imagination. Slavery teaches people to fear freedom. Freedom requires trust, and trust takes time. The wilderness is not a mistake. The wilderness is where redeemed slaves become a covenant people. God does not simply take Israel out of Egypt. He forms Israel into his people. That happens in the wilderness, at bitter water, at empty bellies, at dry places, at Sinai, in failure, in mercy, in law, in worship. In waiting, historically, the wilderness period is one of the hardest parts to confirm archaeologically. The Bible speaks of 40 years, a large population movement through desert encampments, manna, quail water from rock. Sinai tabernacle, yet archaeologists have not found clear evidence of a massive Israelite presence moving through Sinai for 40 years. This is one reason many scholars doubt the Exodus happened on the biblical scale. We should be honest about that. But we should also ask what kind of evidence desert nomads leave. Not much. Especially if they lived in tents, moved often, used perishable materials, and left no permanent settlements. The desert is both preserving and erasing. A massive population should perhaps leave more trace. A smaller group might leave almost none. This is why some scholars propose that the Exodus may have involved a smaller group whose memory later became central to all Israel. That theory attempts to account for both the power of the tradition and the limited archaeological footprint. Whether one accepts that or not, it shows the range of possibilities. The historical question is not simply yes or no. It may be scale, memory transmission, and theological shaping. But the theological claim of Exodus remains: God delivered his people. God brought them to himself. God formed them by covenant. Now comes Sinai. The mountain, the cloud, the fire, the thunder, the voice, the law. If the sea is the birth canal of Israel, Sinai is the covenant ceremony. God says, "I am the Lord thy God, which have brought thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage." The law begins with grace. God does not say, "Obey me and then I will rescue you." He says, "I rescued you, therefore walk as my people." That is the order of covenant. Deliverance first, obedience second. Grace before law, identity before command. This is often missed. People think Exodus is about legalism. But the 10 Commandments begin with redemption. Israel obeys not to earn deliverance, but because they have been delivered. The law teaches freed slaves how to live as God's people. Do not worship other gods. Do not make idols. Do not misuse God's name. Remember Sabbath, honor father and mother, do not murder. Do not commit adultery, do not steal. Do not bear false witness, do not covet. These commandments are not random restrictions. They are anti-Egypt. Egypt was full of gods. Israel must worship one Lord. Egypt used people. Israel must honor life. Egypt oppressed labor. Israel must rest. Egypt built identity around Pharaoh. Israel must build identity around God. The law is freedom ordered under holiness. Modern people often think freedom means no commandments. Exodus says true freedom requires right worship. A people without law will return to bondage under appetite, power, fear, or idols. The 10 Commandments are not chains. They are the architecture of covenant life. Now, the covenant form itself has ancient parallels. Scholars have compared biblical covenants with ancient treaty forms. A great king identifies himself. He recounts past benefits. He lays out obligations. He gives witnesses, blessings, and curses. The Sinai covenant has similarities to ancient treaty forms. That does not make it less divine. It means God spoke in forms the ancient world could understand. God meets people in history. He does not speak in abstractions floating above culture. He gives covenant in a world where covenants mattered. The Bible is historical all the way down: language, law, ritual, geography, memory, covenant. All of it is embodied. Then comes the golden calf. This is devastating. Israel has heard the voice of God. They have seen fire. They have trembled at the mountain. Moses goes up. The people grow impatient. They demand gods. Aaron makes the calf. They say, "These be thy gods, O Israel, which brought thee up out of the land of Egypt." That is madness, but it is human. The people are free from Egypt, but Egypt's imagination remains inside them. They want a visible God, a manageable God, a God they can carry, a God that looks like strength, a God that gives religious comfort without holy obedience. The golden calf shows that idolatry is not merely worshiping something false. Idolatry is trying to control the divine. It is making God visible on our terms. It is reducing mystery to an object. It is turning deliverance into religious convenience, and it happens at the foot of the mountain. That should humble us. People can witness miracles and still make idols. People can be delivered and still rebel. People can receive commandments and break them before the tablets reach the camp. Again, Exodus is not flattering. It tells the truth. This is why the book is historically and spiritually believable. Real people do this. They cry out for deliverance. They receive mercy. Then they panic when God seems delayed. They promise obedience. Then they build idols. They fear judgment. Then they repeat sin. The golden calf is not ancient foolishness only, it is modern religion. We still make golden calves, not usually statues, but manageable gods. Gods of politics. Gods of money, gods of fame, gods of emotion, gods of pleasure, gods of self, gods who never contradict us, gods who never can predict us, gods who never command holiness, gods who bless what we already wanted. Exodus exposes this. Now, after the golden calf, the question becomes, can God dwell with a sinful people? That is the question behind the tabernacle. Many readers get lost in the tabernacle chapters, measurements, curtains, gold, boards, altars, lampstands, priestly garments, consecration rituals. Modern readers may wonder why so much detail is given. But the tabernacle is not decorative filler. It is the answer to the deepest crisis. The holy God has delivered an unholy people. How can he live among them without consuming them? The tabernacle is ordered holiness. It is sacred space. It is Eden language reappearing gold, cherubim. Lampstand like a tree, priestly service, approach guarded. God dwelling among his people. Genesis lost Eden. Exodus builds a portable sanctuary. The presence of God will travel with Israel. That is astonishing. The God who defeated Egypt does not merely command from afar. He dwells in the midst of his people, but his presence must be approached through sacrifice, priesthood, cleansing, and holiness. This is not because God is distant, it is because God is holy. Modern people often want intimacy without holiness. Exodus refuses that. God draws near, but he defines the terms of nearness. The tabernacle says God is with us, but God is not casual. That tension is central to biblical worship. Nearness and reverence. Mercy and holiness, presence and sacrifice. The glory comes down. At the end of Exodus, the cloud covers the tent. The glory of the Lord fills the tabernacle. That is the true climax of the book. Not merely escape, not merely plagues, not merely sea, not even Sinai alone. God dwelling with his people. Exodus begins with Israel groaning under Pharaoh. It ends with God's glory in the camp. That is the movement. From bondage to presence, from bricks to glory, from Pharaoh's house to God's house, from forced labor to holy worship. This is why the famous command, "Let my people go," is incomplete if we stop there. God says, "Let my people go, that they may serve me." Freedom is for worship. Deliverance is for communion. Israel is freed from Pharaoh in order to belong to God. Everyone belongs to someone. The question is not whether we serve. The question is whom we serve. Exodus says it is better to serve the Lord in the wilderness than Pharaoh in the store cities. Better holy dependence than comfortable bondage. Better manna with God than meat pots without him. Now let us return to Exodus and archaeology. The strongest skeptical argument is that there is no evidence for a massive exodus as described in a straightforward reading of the numbers. If hundreds of thousands of adult males plus women and children wandered for 40 years, one might expect more trace. No clear Egyptian record, no confirmed wilderness camps, no Moses inscription. No plague record. No chariot wheels verified in the sea, no direct proof of Sinai. These are real challenges. The strongest believing response is that several features of the story fit Egypt well. Egyptian names and settings, Semitic presence in the Delta, forced labor systems, the city of Ramesses. The root language, the importance of the wilderness, the covenant form. The early and central nature of the Exodus tradition in Israel's memory, and the appearance of Israel in Canaan by the late 13th century before Christ. The Merneptah stela is crucial here. It is an Egyptian inscription from around 1205 BCE that mentions Israel in Canaan. That means that by that time a people called Israel existed in the land. The stela does not prove the Exodus, but it gives us a historical anchor. Israel is not a late fantasy invented centuries later out of nothing. A people called Israel was known to Egypt by the late 13th century. So if there was an Exodus, it had to fit before or around that broader horizon depending on the dating model. This is where the debate becomes complex. Some scholars argue that Israel emerged mostly from within Canaan itself, from highland settlers who gradually formed a distinct identity. Others argue that a group from Egypt joined with Canaanite highland groups, and that their Exodus memory became central to the whole people. Others defend a larger Exodus closer to the biblical description. There is no universal agreement, but the middle view is interesting because it explains something important. Why would Israel's central identity be rooted in Egypt if there was no Egyptian memory at all? Why would a people invent slavery as their origin? Why not claim noble ancestry from mighty kings? Why not claim they were always native rulers? Why ground their identity in humiliation, dependence, and divine rescue? That does not prove every detail, but it makes the tradition hard to dismiss as meaningless fiction. Foundational memories usually come from somewhere. They may be shaped, they may be expanded, they may be theologized, but they often preserve a historical wound. Exodus feels like a wound remembered through worship. A people remembers chains. A people remembers crying out. A people remembers blood on doors. A people remembers walking away from empire. A people remembers the sea. A people remembers law in the wilderness. This memory becomes Israel's soul. Now, biblical history is not modern secular history. This was true in Genesis. It is true in Exodus. Exodus does not tell the story to satisfy a modern historian's curiosity. It tells the story to reveal God. God is the main actor. Moses is important, but he is not the hero in the modern sense. Moses argues. Moses fears. Moses gets angry. Moses intercedes. Moses obeys, but the power belongs to God. The plagues are God's signs. The sea is God's deliverance. The law is God's voice. The tabernacle is God's presence. This is the difference between Exodus and a political revolution. A political revolution says, the people rose up and threw off tyranny. Exodus says, the Lord brought us out. Israel did not storm Pharaoh's palace. Israel did not organize a military revolt. Israel did not defeat Egypt by strategy. Israel was delivered. That word matters, delivered. Not self-liberated, delivered. This is why Exodus is the Bible's great salvation pattern. Salvation is not self-improvement. Salvation is rescue. The slave cannot free himself from Pharaoh. The sinner cannot free himself from sin. The dead cannot raise themselves. God must act. That is Exodus, and that is the gospel. For Christians, Exodus becomes even greater in Christ. Jesus is born under a murderous king who kills children. Like Moses, he comes through threatened infancy. He comes out of Egypt. He passes through water in baptism. He enters wilderness testing. He gives law from a mountain. He feeds multitudes with bread. He reveals God's glory. He celebrates Passover. Then he becomes the Passover. At the cross, the true lamb is slain. At the resurrection, the greater Exodus begins. Sin's Pharaoh is defeated. Death's sea is crossed. The people of God are led toward new creation. This is not forced symbolism. The New Testament breathes Exodus. The old deliverance becomes the pattern for the final deliverance. Jesus does what Moses could not fully do. Moses brings Israel out of Egypt. Jesus brings his people out of sin and death. Moses gives the covenant written on stone. Jesus gives the new covenant by his blood and spirit. Moses builds a tabernacle. Jesus is God dwelling among us. Moses intercedes. Jesus ever lives to intercede. Moses sees the promised land from afar. Jesus brings his people into the kingdom. Exodus is fulfilled, not erased. Now let us close the documentary. The camera returns to the desert. The sun is low. The wind moves over sand. A broken brick lies half buried. A shepherd's staff rests near a fire. The shadow of a mountain stretches across the plain. A tent stands in the center of the camp. Above it cloud, within it glory. And the narrator says Exodus is not merely an argument about archaeology. It is not merely a debate about dates. It is not merely a conflict between faith and history. It is the story of a God who hears slaves, a God who remembers covenant, a God who confronts empire, a God who judges false gods, a God who makes a path through the sea, a God who feeds in the wilderness, a God who speaks from the mountain, a God who gives law after grace, a God who forgives betrayal, a God who dwells among his people. History can question it, archaeology can probe it, scholars can debate it, but Exodus still stands as one of the most powerful declarations ever given to mankind. Bondage is not final. The empire is not God. The cry of the oppressed is heard. The blood of the Lamb matters. The sea can open. The wilderness can become a school. The mountain can thunder. The law can shape a people, and the glory of God can dwell in the camp. Genesis told us how the world began. Exodus tells us how redemption begins to move through history with power. Genesis gave the promise. Exodus shows the promise walking out of Egypt under the light of fire. Genesis ended with Joseph waiting in a coffin. Exodus answers with a nation walking free, and yet Exodus itself waits. It waits for a greater prophet, a greater covenant, a greater tabernacle, a greater deliverance. It waits for Christ, because the deepest slavery was never only Egypt. The deepest Pharaoh was never only a man on a throne. The deepest sea was never only water. The deepest wilderness was never only sand. The deepest bondage is sin. The deepest enemy is death. The deepest need is God himself. And the God of Exodus does not merely deliver from something, he delivers for himself. That is the road out of empire. That is Exodus in history. A story rooted in ancient memory. A story debated by scholars. A story carried by Israel. A story fulfilled in Christ. A story still speaking to every soul that knows what bondage feels like. The Lord hears. The Lord remembers. The Lord comes down. The Lord delivers, and when he brings his people out, he does not abandon them in the wilderness. He leads them by fire. He covers them by cloud. He feeds them with bread. He gives them his word. And in the end, he does what Pharaoh never could. He dwells among them. That is the heart of Exodus. Not only freedom, not only judgment, not only law, but presence. The God who says, "Let my people go," also says, "Let them make me a sanctuary, that I may dwell among them." And that is where the road leads, out of slavery, through the sea, to the mountain, into covenant, under the cloud, before the glory. With God in the midst,